Welcome to SnoozyTor, where history doesn't roar, it whispers. Where the rise and fall of empires drift through candlelight and rain. Tonight, we travel to the sands of eternity, to a land of golden gods, sleeping kings, and the endless rhythm of the Nile. This is not a lecture. It's a dream told in ink and memory, the story of the Eternal Scribe of Egypt, a voice that has watched the world for 3,000 years, writing the rise of pharaohs, the silence of tombs, and the long, slow heartbeat of a civilization that refused to die. So dim the lights, let the hum of the river carry you. And as the first words unfold, remember, the past never truly sleeps. It only waits to be remembered. Soft pause, sound of desert wind and distant bells. You are listening to SnoozyTor. Let's begin our journey through the Eternal Scribe of Egypt. I remember the sound of wind before I remember my own name. It moved through tall grass like the breath of a sleeping god. Back then, Egypt was not yet Egypt. It was a green world, endless savanna stretching beneath soft clouds, the Nile only a shy ribbon winding through marsh and forest. I was a hunter then, one among many who followed the herds. We lived by the rhythm of the seasons, by the stars that guided us at night, by the whisper of rain on our skin. I did not know what history was. No one did. We did not yet think of tomorrow as different from today. The world simply was, and that was enough. Sometimes I wonder, can you imagine such a time? A time when no one spoke of kings or gods or death. When survival itself was the only prayer. Each morning I woke to the calls of birds and the scent of wet soil. The herds moved north and we followed them, carrying our spears, our children, and the fire we had learned to tame. The sun was gentler then. The rains came often. Every flood of the great river left behind a dark blanket of silt so rich that even the wild reeds grew as tall as a man. We did not yet name the river Nile, but we knew it as the pulse of life. I remember one day, my first memory perhaps. The sky turned silver after a storm, and I saw reflections of stars in every pool of water. Something inside me stirred, something beyond hunger or fear. I felt the world speaking in patterns. The tracks of gazelles across the mud, the flight of birds in spirals, the way the river bent like a sleeping snake. It was all a kind of language, though I could not yet write or read. It whispered, remember this. Sometimes when I close my eyes even now, I hear that same whisper. Do you ever hear the world when it tries to speak to you? Maybe through the rustle of leaves, or the hum of distant rain. That was how it began for me, the first spark of memory, the beginning of my long duty. Seasons passed. The rains became less certain. The green world began to shrink. The animals moved closer to the river. So did we. We built small shelters of reeds and mud and learned to plant seeds where the floods had been. It felt like magic, that from something so small could grow a stalk of grain, enough to feed a family. Our camps became villages. Our steps along the river became roads. We began to stay in one place long enough to bury our dead. I carved lines into bone to mark the passing moons. The lines meant nothing to others, but to me they were proof that time itself could be tamed. Each mark was a heartbeat of memory, a rhythm of the world captured by a human hand. I didn't know then that I had begun the work I would do for eternity, recording, remembering, preserving. The world was changing and so was I. People began to gather in larger groups. They argued, traded, dreamed. We discovered that our hands could shape not only tools but meaning. The first gods appeared, spirits of water, sun, and sky. We built small shrines from stone and sang to the heavens. When I looked into the smoke of the fire, I felt something watching back. A presence that would one day have 1,000 names, carved in gold and alabaster. At night, when the fires burned low, I would look at the stars. They seemed fixed and eternal, yet I could feel time flowing beneath them like the river itself. I did not yet understand that I would walk that flow again and again, through ages of kings and conquerors, through sandstorms and silence. But perhaps, some part of me already knew. The wind still moved through the grass, though less each year. The herds grew thinner. We followed the river north, searching for a place that would not vanish. And there, on a bend where the soil was black and sweet, we stayed. We built the first village that would become the first city. I planted reeds by the water's edge and said softly to the river, I will remember you. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, imagine that place, the world before pyramids, before pharaohs, before history itself. The scent of rain, the sound of frogs, the slow breathing of the earth after flood. Can you feel it? That moment when the human soul first looked at the world and thought, "This must not be forgotten." I was there, and I began to write. The rains began to fade. At first it was only a season late, then two. The grass turned brittle and the herds no longer came in such numbers. The green world that had once seemed endless began to draw back, folding in on itself like a dream at dawn. We followed the retreating water, step by step, closer to the river that still breathed life into the land. The sky changed color. It was no longer silver and soft after storms, but a pale blue that shimmered with heat. I remember the sound of the wind. It carried dust instead of rain. Each morning, the sun rose sharper, hungrier. The river became our teacher, our refuge, our mirror. We learned its moods, the time it slept, the time it rose, the way it carried silt from the heart of Africa to feed our fields. Do you ever notice how change creeps in quietly? How something you thought eternal shifts without sound, until one day you realize the world has become new again. We began to dig channels to guide the floodwater. We learned to store grain in clay jars, to keep fish in reed baskets. The wild had turned to order, and I, reborn now as a young farmer, felt both pride and fear. We had tamed the earth a little. But in doing so, the earth had begun to tame us. When the floods came late, I watched the elders stand by the river, whispering to the water as though speaking to a living God. We made offerings of barley and milk, singing to the unseen powers that governed its rise. That was when we began to name them, the forces behind sun and rain, behind the dark and the dawn. Are they called the sun. And when the moon rose, we felt the eyes of Thoth, the keeper of wisdom, upon us. The world was no longer silent. It spoke through wind and current, and we listened. Sometimes at night I would stand at the edge of the river and look up. The stars seemed clearer now, as though the dry air had burned the haze away. I traced their patterns, connecting dots across the sky, and I realized something strange. The stars returned to the same places again and again, just as the river flooded and withdrew. The heavens had their own rhythm, as steady as the Nile. Do you ever find comfort in repetition? The same sunrise, the same sound of rain, the same familiar moment before sleep? To us it meant safety. Predictability was the first miracle. And so we began to count. Days, moons, floods. Time itself became a thing we could measure. With each mark carved into bone, each symbol scratched into clay, I felt the pull of a new kind of power. The power to remember. The power to pass knowledge beyond a single lifetime. Villages grew along both sides of the river. Boats appeared, small at first, made of reeds, but soon strong enough to carry stone and trade goods. I watched as strangers came floating down from the south, bringing darker skin, strange beads, and stories of lands where the sun rose red. We shared grain, they shared obsidian. We had become part of something greater, a chain of people bound by water. Still, the land beyond the floodplain turned harsher each year. The sand crept closer, swallowing the old hunting grounds. Our children no longer spoke of the savannah. They spoke of the river, the crops, the gods. I wondered if they could even imagine a time when all of Egypt had been green. Sometimes as I sat by the fields, I thought of the people who had come before me, my own past selves perhaps. Hunters, wanderers, dreamers. I felt them behind me like ghosts carried on the wind. Was I still the same soul just wearing new skin? Or had I become something else entirely, a memory that refuses to die? When night fell, I would light a small fire and draw shapes in the dust. The curve of the river, the round moon, the rising sun. The flames made the drawings dance as though alive. And I thought, perhaps this is what the gods want from us. Not worship, but remembrance. To keep the world alive through the act of seeing. The changing sky looked down on us, unblinking. The last rains came and went, and the grasslands were gone. But the river remained, steady and shining, the only thread of eternity in a fragile world. Tonight, as you listen and breathe softly, think of that moment. The silence after the storm, the shimmer of stars over the shrinking floodplain. Every civilization begins there. A people learning to adapt, a river teaching them patience, and someone like me, watching, listening, remembering. The nights grew longer. Without the heavy clouds of the old rains, the sky became a sea of light. The stars were no longer distant flickers. They were maps, signs, companions. Each one seemed to pulse with quiet intention, as if watching us, waiting. I was reborn into this new age as a young apprentice in a small settlement along the upper Nile. My teacher was an elder who spent his evenings tracing constellations in the sand. He said the gods had written their stories in the heavens long before they shaped the earth. When I asked him how he knew, he only smiled and said, "Because the sky repeats what the river remembers." Every night, we climbed a low hill beyond the fields and watched the firmament unfold. There was the hunter, the boat, the crocodile, and the mother cow who gave milk to the world. We learned the timing of the floods by watching the slow rising of a single bright star. Sopdet, the one you now call Sirius. When she appeared before dawn, the river would soon awaken. It was not magic, it was rhythm. The same rhythm that beat beneath our ribs, in the soil, in the pulse of the Nile. Have you ever stood beneath a sky so wide that it made you forget yourself? A silence so deep that it felt like a voice? Sometimes as I watched, I would hear that voice again. The same whisper that spoke to me on the green plains so long ago. Remember this. And so I did. I began to carve small marks into shards of bone. Lines that matched the movements of the stars across the heavens. They were not yet words, not yet numbers. Only memory given shape. Our people built stones in circles to mirror the constellations. We watched shadows slide along their surfaces, telling us when to plant, when to harvest, when to pray. One such circle stood far to the south, near the desert's edge, a place of silence called Nabta Playa. There, I helped align great stones so that at the rising of the sun during midsummer, their shadows would meet perfectly in the center. It was as if the gods themselves had reached down to touch the earth. Do you believe the heavens can speak? Or do you think it is only our longing that gives them voices? The more I studied the sky, the more I felt its pull within me. The stars became my first text. Their slow revolutions the first sentences I ever learned to read. When one star dimmed and another brightened, I saw the pattern of birth and death, a mirror of our own fragile existence below. We began to give names to the forces around us, not because we thought the gods were far away, but because we sensed they were near, dwelling in wind and flame and river. Every spark from our fires was a breath of Ra. Every glimmer on the water was the reflection of Hathor's eye. When the moon rose full and pale, I felt Thoth guiding my hand as I drew lines in the sand, shapes that would one day become letters, and letters that would one day become eternity. One evening, a storm gathered beyond the western hills. Thunder rolled across the desert like a drumbeat. The elder beside me whispered that such storms marked the turning of ages. He said, "When the stars fall silent, listen to the earth instead." And I understood. Our world was no longer just something we lived in, but something we could read, measure, and perhaps even preserve. As I grew older, I taught others to watch the skies. We marked the passing of time not by the beating of hearts, but by the slow procession of constellations. I realized that memory itself could be built from pattern, and that in every rhythm lay a promise, that what has been will be again. Tonight, as you lie beneath your own sky, different stars perhaps, but the same vast silence, look up for a moment before you drift into sleep. Can you still feel that voice in the dark? The one that hums softly behind the wind? It has never stopped speaking. It is the same voice that guided me then, the same voice that teaches all who listen, the voice of the stars. The river had always been our road, our teacher, our silent boundary, but now it became something more, a line dividing two worlds. To the south, the mountains held the red stone of the Upper Kingdom. To the north, wide marshes opened into the sea, where the river spread its fingers like a hand. Between them flowed the Nile, uniting what men could not yet name. I was born again in that age of division. I lived on the southern banks, where the hills turned golden in the evening light. The people there called themselves the people of the reed. Across the waters lived those of the papyrus. We traded with them, sometimes quarreled, sometimes sang across the river at night. But we were still one family, though we did not yet understand how much we belonged to the same breath of the Nile. Each year the floods came and went, painting the valley in green. We built dikes and measured the depth of the water with tall sticks marked by carved notches. Those who read the marks, the early scribes, were treated like seers. Their eyes followed numbers instead of stars, yet both reached for the same truth. That order could be found in the world if one only learned to listen carefully. Do you ever notice how people seek patterns? In clouds, in music, in the quiet turns of their own days? Perhaps it is our way of fighting chaos, of proving that life makes sense. In those days, a man named Narmer rose among us. He was neither God nor spirit, only a man, yet one who seemed born with the patience of the river itself. He spoke softly, but when he did, the people listened. He said the two lands must become one, for the river does not choose sides. The gods flow through both banks, and their reflection shines the same on north and south alike. I was a scribe in his service then, still young, still learning how to press lines into clay. I traveled with his retinue as he journeyed downriver, uniting village after village. The boats moved in silence except for the rhythm of oars striking water. Each stroke felt like a heartbeat of the new kingdom being born. And when we reached the delta, where the papyrus swayed in the wind, Narmer stood before the gathered chieftains and raised a small ivory tablet carved with two crowns. One white, one red. The first symbol of unity. The birthmark of Egypt. I remember the moment clearly, the hush that fell as he placed the crowns together. It was as if the gods themselves paused to breathe. Even the river stilled for a heartbeat. And in that silence, I felt something vast awaken. The sense that our lives were now part of something greater, something that would outlive us all. Later that night, I sat beside the campfire, scratching words into a shard of pottery. The two lands are one. It was a simple line, but it felt heavy, as though it belonged to the world itself, not to me. Do you ever write something, a word, a thought, a promise, and feel that it came from beyond you, as if you were only the hand that carried it into being? That was how it felt that night. The wind moved through the reeds, whispering like voices of the ancestors. I thought of every life I had lived before, every field, every star, every flood, and realized they had all been leading here, to this joining of lands and hearts. The next morning, Narmer walked the banks with his followers. He dipped his hands into the Nile and lifted the water toward the sun. "Two hands, one river," he said. And then he smiled, the kind of smile that kings wear before they become more than men. We built temples soon after, small at first, then larger, carved from limestone. I learned to record offerings and prayers, to list the names of farmers, workers, and soldiers who served the crown. Each mark in my scroll was a seed of order planted against chaos, and I began to understand that writing itself was our shield, our way of preserving Ma'at, the divine balance that keeps the world from falling apart. As night fell, the priests lit torches along the temple walls. The river reflected their flames until it looked as if the water itself were on fire. I stood there, watching the twin crowns glimmer in the distance, and thought, perhaps every kingdom, every life, is just the joining of two halves. Light and shadow, body and soul, memory and time. If you listen closely, you might still hear that joining. In the pulse beneath your wrist, in the rhythm of your breath, in the quiet flow of your own life toward the sea of sleep. Close your eyes now and imagine the first dawn over a united Egypt. The two lands are one, and history at last has begun. It began with a mark. Not a word, not yet, just a simple line drawn into soft clay. A ripple of memory made visible. I pressed my reed into the wet surface and watched the groove appear, a small shadow catching the last light of evening. It meant nothing to anyone else, but to me it meant I remember. In the days after the unification, Egypt was breathing like a newborn, slowly, cautiously, beautifully. The river carried grain and copper, fish and linen north and south. Temples grew larger. Kings demanded record keepers. And I, once a servant to the river and the stars, became something new, a keeper of time itself. Have you ever tried to hold a memory so tightly that you feared it might slip away? That was what I felt each time I dipped my reed in ink. We began with pictures. A fish for water, a bird for air, a loaf for bread. Each sign a fragment of the world, caught and frozen like a dragonfly in amber. The symbols came easily at first, but soon we found ourselves needing more. Ways to describe not just what we saw, but what we felt. I remember sitting in the courtyard of the temple at Abydos, the air thick with the scent of crushed papyrus and burning oil. The high scribe, my teacher, looked at the wet marks on my clay tablet. "You have written what is," he said. "Now learn to write what was, and what shall be." And so, we began to chase the soul of language itself. Our words became lighter, more abstract. A leaf turned to a sound, a bird to a syllable. Each combination opened another door. Before long we could name the unseen. Love, fear, the will of the gods. And when I wrote a king's name for the first time inside an oval frame, a cartouche, the priest whispered that I had bound eternity itself. Do you ever think about the weight of your name? How every letter you write is a small act of permanence. We felt that deeply then. A name was not just sound, it was the soul carved into time. As the system grew, so did our need for memory. Scribes multiplied. Workshops echoed with the scratching of reeds. I walked among them, teaching the young to steady their hands, to keep their breath calm so that ink would flow smoothly. Each child learned to breathe with the same rhythm as the Nile. Slow, patient, unhurried. There was peace in that repetition. And as I watched their faces glow in the lamplight, I understood why the gods had chosen us for this task. Words, like seeds, had to be planted carefully, so they might one day bloom into meaning. One night, after the others had gone, I stayed in the scriptorium alone. Outside, the moon hung over the temple roofs, pale and round like an unfinished tablet. I dipped my reed and wrote on a scrap of broken pottery. The world endures because we remember. Then I waited, listening for the sound of the river in the distance. Steady, eternal. And I knew I had found my purpose across lifetimes. When the king's architects built the first storerooms for scrolls, they said they were building houses for the gods of memory. I helped carry the earliest rolls, reeds pressed into papyrus, words sealed with wax, names written in red for the divine. Each one was a breath, trapped but still alive. We stacked them in darkness, trusting that one day they would be read again. And tonight, perhaps they are. Perhaps your world, so full of noise and light, is reading what my trembling hands first carved in silence. Have you ever stopped to listen to ink dry? It sounds like the soft breath of time itself, cooling, sealing, promising to endure. As I lay down my reed that night, I thought of the river once more, how it carries what we give it, how it remembers without trying. And I whispered to the wind, let these words be like the Nile, flowing, endless, alive. Close your eyes, traveler of time. Listen for the quiet scratch of a reed on clay, the heartbeat of civilization in its first moment of speech. This is how eternity learned to speak, through ink, through patience, through the steady hand of those who refused to forget. The years drifted like sand through my fingers. Dynasties rose, kings grew old, and still I remained, reborn again, a quiet observer in the heart of Egypt's first golden dawn. Now I served under a king named Djoser. He was not like other rulers. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of stone. He dreamed not of war or conquest, but of eternity, the kind that does not fade when breath is gone. He had a man beside him, his architect and priest, a figure the world would later call Imhotep. I knew him not as legend, but as a quiet soul, whose eyes saw farther than any horizon. He would walk the plains of Saqqara at dusk, hands folded behind his back, watching how shadows stretched across the sand. He said the earth was trying to remember the shape of heaven. Do you ever feel that, the stillness of a place where creation seems to wait for permission to begin? One morning, Imhotep called me to his side. Write this, he said, his voice calm, steady as the Nile. A house for the body is not enough. The king needs a stairway not to live again, but to rise. And so we began. Day after day, we marked the desert with lines and ropes, measuring not in steps but in centuries. Men carried limestone from quarries to the south, their songs rising like prayer. Dust hung in the air, shimmering in the sun. It clung to our skin until we too felt carved from stone. At night, when the workers slept, I climbed the scaffolds and stood among the half-finished walls. The moonlight turned every block silver, every angle precise as a thought. I placed my palm against the cold stone and whispered, "You will outlive us all." Have you ever touched something and known it would remain long after you're gone? The pyramid grew, not smooth and gleaming as later ones would, but tiered, a staircase of light. Each level lifted Djoser closer to the sky. Imhotep called it the House of Eternity, but to me it felt like a frozen prayer, a hymn made solid. I wrote every measurement, every delivery, every name of the workers who cut and hauled and sang. I thought, perhaps this is how the gods measure us, not by our birth or power, but by the precision of our devotion. One evening, a storm swept across the desert. The workers took shelter inside the lower chambers, and I stayed with them, holding a torch as wind screamed through the corridors. When the storm passed, Imhotep appeared at the entrance, his robe full of sand, his eyes shining. He said softly, "Now the sky has tested it. It will stand." And it did. When the final stone was placed, the sun broke through the haze, casting long light across the structure. It was the first time the desert had ever touched the sky with human hands. The people cheered. Priests sang hymns. But I simply stood in silence, feeling the weight of history settle like dust in my lungs. Later, in the cool shadow of the finished monument, Imhotep handed me a small tablet of polished limestone. "Write the king's name," he said. I did. And as I carved, the thought came to me that each stroke of the chisel was a heartbeat, each curve a breath made eternal. Do you think it's possible for stone to dream? If so, then that pyramid was dreaming still. A dream of permanence in a world of wind. As night fell, torches flickered along its base. From afar, it looked like a stairway made of fire. I lay in the sand, staring upward, listening to the whisper of the desert, the heartbeat of men, the stillness of stars. And I thought, perhaps every act of creation is a defiance of forgetting. Perhaps every builder, every scribe, every dreamer is trying to write their name across the horizon of time. Close your eyes, traveler. Imagine the warm breath of wind through ancient stone, the soft hum of chisels echoing across endless sand. That rhythm, slow, steady, unyielding, is the pulse of eternity beginning to take shape. The desert was quiet again. Centuries had passed since Djoser's stairway first touched the sky, and yet the sand still whispered his name. I had returned in another body, another pair of hands, but the same soul, still drawn to stone, to memory, to the edge of eternity. Now I served a new king. His name was Khufu, and his dream was vast enough to silence all others. He wished to raise a mountain of perfect form, smooth as moonlight, rising from the desert as if carved by the gods themselves. Not a stairway, but a single breath of stone, a line between earth and heaven too perfect to fade. I was older then, or at least my soul was. I no longer hurried. I watched, I wrote, and I listened to the rhythm of men's labor, as they shaped history grain by grain. Do you know the sound of thousands of feet walking in sand at dawn? It is softer than you think, like the tide of the sea made of dust. That was how our mornings began. The workers came from across the land. Farmers during the flood season, craftsmen from Memphis, stonecutters from Aswan. They were not slaves as later ages would claim. They were sons of Egypt, each one proud to build something that would outlast his name. At noon the sun burned white. Sweat ran like small rivers down brown skin. The air shimmered. Even the hawks above flew slower, and still they sang. Their voices rose in rhythm with the pulleys and sledges, ancient songs of balance and breath. The same songs that once carried Djoser's stones, now reborn on a grander scale. I recorded everything. The deliveries of copper tools, the rations of bread and beer, the daily prayers to Ta for strength and steady hands. Each line of ink was a heartbeat of the great work. I felt it growing not just upward but inward, a pulse of human will gathering beneath the desert sun. Sometimes at night I climbed the unfinished slope alone. The wind cooled the stone until it glowed pale blue under the moon. From the summit I could see the whole valley asleep. The river, the villages, the fires of camp faint as stars. The pyramid's shadow stretched longer than any temple, as if even darkness bowed before it. I often wondered, why do we build so high when we ourselves are so small? Perhaps it is to remind the heavens that we exist. Or perhaps it is simply our way of whispering, remember us. Khufu himself would visit sometimes, not as a god but as a man with tired eyes. He would place his hand on the limestone and ask quietly, will it last? And I would answer, yes, my lord, as long as the river flows and the stars keep their course. He smiled once, just once, and said, then write that promise into the stone so the gods can hold us to it. So I did. Beneath the passages, hidden in the weight of the mountain, I carved a single line. To rise is to remember. Years turned to decades. Children of the first builders grew old and watched their sons take up their tools. Each generation added another heartbeat of stone. And when the final capstone was lifted, gleaming white beneath the sun, the people fell silent. Even the desert seemed to pause, as though listening to its own echo through time. No one spoke. No one needed to. For there it stood, a perfect triangle of light, a frozen hymn to endurance. As night came, I sat on the eastern side, where the moonlight kissed the base. I pressed my palm into the cool rock and closed my eyes. I could still hear the laughter of the builders, the prayers, the faint hum of chisels and wind. And I thought, perhaps we build not to escape death, but to teach the world how to remember life. When I opened my eyes, the stars had aligned above the pyramid's edge, each one perfectly mirrored in the geometry of the stone. It felt as if heaven itself had finally learned our language. So I whispered into the sand, "May it last until the sky forgets its stars." Now, when I dream, I sometimes stand again in that desert, the wind soft, the pyramid glowing like a second moon. It does not belong to one king or one age. It belongs to all who have ever hoped to leave something eternal behind. Close your eyes, traveler. Imagine the hum of the desert, the soft vibration of a million breaths turned to stone. This is Egypt's heartbeat. Slow, patient, endless. The pyramid was finished. Its shadow stretched across the desert like a sundial of eternity, marking not hours but centuries yet to come. And though the king's name would echo through ages, I knew the true heartbeat of this monument belonged not to the ruler, but to the hands that had built it. By then, I lived among the workers. We called our village the place of truth. It sat just beyond the pyramid's foot, a small world of laughter, quarrels, and the smell of bread baking in clay ovens. When the sun rose, it struck the limestone walls, and the whole village shimmered as if it too were made of gold. Do you ever think of the hands behind the wonders you see? The quiet labor, the small joys, the unseen lives beneath the grand stories? Their days began before dawn. Men carried water from wells, women ground grain into flour, children chased each other between huts, leaving tiny footprints in the dust, footprints that even now, I sometimes imagine are still there, sleeping under the sand. In the evenings, after work was done, they would gather near the river to wash the day's dust away. Some sang songs of home, simple tunes about harvests and lovers waiting by the palms. Others played flutes carved from reeds, their notes soft and wandering like the Nile at night. I sat beside them often, recording their names on small shards of pottery. Not kings, not generals, just men. Teddy the carpenter, who could cut a beam so straight it seemed divine. Hapu the brewer, who made beer thick and sweet as honey. Nefret, who wove linen so fine it caught the wind like water. Their names mattered to me, because without them, eternity would be hollow. Have you ever wondered who remembers the nameless? I did. So I wrote them down line by line, knowing the desert would one day cover their homes, but hoping that somehow their laughter would remain. Sometimes there were quarrels. Stolen tools, missing rations, broken promises. They would bring their disputes to me, for even then I served as a recorder, a scribe not only of kings but of ordinary lives. I learned that history is not made by perfection, but by persistence. At night, I would watch the fires flicker across the camp, each one a tiny star fallen to earth. The workers told stories of the gods, how Ra sailed his golden boat across the sky, how Isis searched for the pieces of Osiris, how the stars were once men who built too high and were taken into heaven. They told those tales softly, their voices warm, tired, woven with the scent of smoke and roasted barley. And as I listened, I realized something. This too was architecture, not of stone, but of words, each story another brick in the house of memory. Once a young boy asked me, "Will they ever know our names?" I smiled and said, "Perhaps not all, but the gods will. And perhaps one day, someone will whisper your name in a dream, and for that moment you will live again." He nodded, as if he understood something I had spent lifetimes learning. When the floods came, we left the desert and returned to the villages, the river reclaiming its rhythm. The pyramid stood alone again, silent, unmoving. But beneath it, in the chambers of the dead and the living, echoes remained. Footsteps, songs, the breath of 1,000 builders carried away by the wind. Sometimes when the sandstorm sweeps over Giza, I hear them again. The laughter, the rhythm of hammers, the murmur of prayers to Ta. It all sounds like a heartbeat under the dunes. Do you hear it too? The faint hum behind the silence of time? If you listen closely enough, you might feel it. A soft vibration in the bones of the earth, reminding you that nothing truly disappears, only changes shape. So rest easy, traveler, for even the smallest life leaves a trace. Even forgotten names find their way into eternity, and beneath the sand, where stars once walked as men, the voices still whisper, "We were here, we built, we dreamed." Time passed again, quietly like a tide retreating from the shore. Khufu's great monument glowed beneath the sun, and generations were born in its shadow, learning to measure their lives by the color of the morning light on its stones. I, the Eternal Scribe, returned once more, this time in service to his son, Khafre. and later to the gentle Menkaure. Their names, too, would be etched into the desert's heart, their tunes rising like golden echoes beside their fathers. By then, the art of eternity had become familiar. No longer an impossible dream, but a discipline, a craft. We knew how to move mountains now, with levers, sledges, ropes, and songs. It was the songs that mattered most. Have you ever noticed how a song can make hard work feel lighter? How rhythm turns exhaustion into grace? Each morning, before the sun reached the horizon, the overseers would call out the beat, and thousands of voices would answer. We sang not to the gods, but to one another, to keep the ropes steady, to keep the spirit calm. The pyramids were built on breath as much as stone. Khafre was a proud king, his eyes sharp as a falcon's, his temples gleaming white with polished limestone. He built his own pyramid beside his father's, and at its feet, he ordered a guardian to be carved, a creature of human wisdom and leonine strength. I remember the first night I saw it take shape in the moonlight, the face still rough, the body half buried in stone. A worker whispered beside me, "It looks as if the desert itself is waking." And I thought, yes, perhaps it is. The Sphinx was not carved for eternity. It was carved from eternity, as if the earth itself wished to speak. Do you ever look at something ancient and feel that it's looking back at you? That was how I felt the first time I looked into its unfinished eyes. Years later, Menkaure took the throne. A smaller pyramid, a gentler rule. Where Khufu's pyramid was thunder and Khafre's was command, Menkaure's felt like a song of peace. He cared less for the size of his tomb than for the fairness of his reign. He visited the workers' village, spoke with the farmers, and brought offerings himself to the temple of Hathor. He would say, "A good heart builds longer than stone." And I, ever the recorder of kings, wrote those words in red ink, the color reserved for the sacred. In those days, Egypt shone brightest under the sun. The gods seemed close enough to touch, their images reflected in every polished wall. Priests walked in rows of white linen, bearing lotus flowers that perfumed the air. Every city hummed with balance. Ma'at, the perfect order of all things, preserved through ritual, honesty, and measured breath. At dusk, I would walk to the riverbank, watching the sun sink behind the pyramids. Their sharp edges softened into gold, then purple, then shadow. The air cooled and the wind carried the sound of flutes. I thought often of the men who had built them, and of the kings whose names they bore. They had each reached for heaven in their own way, and now heaven had reached back. Sometimes when the sandstorm rose, the Sphinx would vanish in a swirl of gold and ash. But when the sky cleared, its gaze always remained, calm, patient, knowing. To me, it was the face of memory itself. Do you believe that stone can think? That somewhere within its silence lies a kind of awareness, not of words, but of presence? I think it does. For every dawn, when the first light touches the Sphinx's brow, I feel it breathe. The kings of the sun are long gone now, but their monuments still hold the warmth of their mornings, the rhythm of their builders, the echo of their prayers. And I, the Eternal Scribe, still hear their whispers when the desert sleeps. Close your eyes, traveler. Let the weight of centuries settle softly around you. The stones are still warm from the day. The sky hums faintly with the memory of the sun. And somewhere, beneath layers of wind and time, the kings still dream, bathed in light that never fades. When I think of Egypt, I do not see stone first. I see water. The river, my oldest companion. The one thread that never broke, no matter how many kings rose or fell. Every morning, the Nile awakens like a god stretching in his bed of reeds. Mist curls above the surface, and the air smells faintly of clay, grain, and sunlight waiting to be born. I would sit at its edge with my writing board, watching fishermen cast nets that glittered like spider silk in the dawn. Their songs drifted across the water, soft prayers to the spirit that gave and took in equal measure. Do you ever wake and feel the world breathing with you? A pulse beyond your own heart, steady and ancient? That is what the Nile was to us. We called it Happy, the god of the flood, the bringer of life. Every summer when the rains came far to the south, the river rose as if remembering us. It spilled over the fields, leaving behind a black silt so rich it looked like the night sky spread upon the earth. Without the flood, there was no Egypt. Without Egypt, there was no memory of man. Each year, when the waters began to fall, we held the festival of renewal. Priests carried statues of the gods through the streets, Ra the sun, Osiris of the underworld, Isis the mother, and Maat, feather of truth and order. I stood among the scribes, recording hymns as petals of lotus rained down from temple balconies. Children laughed. Women poured milk and honey into the river, and the air shimmered with joy. We believed the gods walked among us then. Their presence felt in the heat, the wind, the breath of the water. I once asked a high priest, "How do we know the gods are real?" He smiled, his eyes kind beneath a heavy headdress. "When you write, do you not feel words move through you, as if you are only the vessel?" I nodded. "Then so it is with the gods," he said. "We are their ink." That thought stayed with me for lifetimes. At sunset, I would follow the priests into the temples, where cool darkness smelled of incense and oil. Statues loomed in the torchlight, their faces calm, their eyes inlaid with stone that caught even the smallest flame. We washed the statues, dressed them, fed them bread and wine as if they were living beings. It was not worship as you might imagine it now. It was care, the tending of a relationship between heaven and earth. Do you ever feel gratitude for something you cannot see? That was what filled our temples. A quiet reverence, a love without need of proof. When one of us died, we said he had gone west, following the sun into the land of night. We buried our dead with food, letters, amulets, and small Shabdi figures who would serve them in the afterlife. Death was not an end to us, but a doorway opening toward light. I remember writing the book of going forth by day, the words carved on tomb walls to guide the spirit beyond. I wrote, "May your heart be light against the feather of truth. May your name be spoken in the halls of the west. May your soul sail with Ra in his boat of morning." And as I wrote, I wondered, what if these words are not just prayers for the dead, but lessons for the living? To live with a heart light as a feather, to speak truth even when no one listens, to rise each morning as if reborn. Sometimes at dusk I walked along the riverbanks, where farmers watered their fields, and I could feel both worlds, the mortal and the divine, braided together in the golden light. The sound of water against the reeds, the distant call of an ibis bird, the hum of the earth cooling under the sun's farewell. It all felt like a hymn that needed no temple. Do you hear it too, traveler? The river's low murmur, steady and timeless, flowing beneath your thoughts even now. That is Egypt's true prayer, not carved in stone or sung by priests, but whispered by the water that remembers us all. Close your eyes. Feel the cool weight of air after sunset. The Nile flows still, carrying the voices of kings, farmers, and scribes alike. Listen, and let its rhythm carry you into gentle sleep. It began so quietly that few noticed. A whisper in the floodwaters, a silence in the wind. The Nile, our eternal river, rose a little less each year. At first we thought it a passing whim of the gods, but soon the reeds began to yellow, and the fields cracked beneath a sun that no longer blessed but burned. I was there, the scribe of a fading kingdom. The temples still gleamed, the pyramids still caught the dawn, but beneath their light the people hungered. Bread grew thin, and voices that once sang hymns of gratitude now murmured prayers of desperation. Do you know the sound of hunger, traveler? It is not loud. It is the quiet scraping of a bowl long after the grain is gone, the rustle of dry palms over empty baskets, the soft sigh of a mother pretending not to be hungry, so her child can eat. In those days I walked from village to village, carrying tablets of records, taxes, harvests, decrees. But soon there were no harvests to count, no taxes to collect, and the decrees of kings were lost beneath the cries of the people. The great families turned inward, hoarding grain in their estates. The temples too, once houses of plenty, began to lock their doors. Priests whispered that the gods had turned away. But I knew it was not the gods who turned. It was we who had forgotten balance. Do you remember I once told you of Maat, the feather of truth, the harmony that held the world together? Without it, even stone crumbles, and men begin to see one another not as brothers but as beasts. There were riots in the delta. Tombs were broken open for gold and food. I saw the pyramids, those stairways to eternity, defaced by hands too desperate to care for holiness. Men tore the jewels from the mummies of kings. They said, "The dead have no need of gold while the living starve." And yet, even in that darkness, I saw moments of grace. A farmer sharing his last loaf with a stranger. A priest lighting incense in an abandoned shrine. A mother singing to her child as if the gods could still hear. It reminded me that order can flicker even in ruin, like a candle in a collapsing hall. Once during that famine, I found a fragment of an old prayer written by a hand like mine, centuries before. The river will falter, but the heart must flow. The sun will hide, but truth remains bright. I copied it onto my own tablet, and for a long while I read it aloud to any who would listen. "Do you think the gods still hear us?" a young girl asked me. I smiled, though my heart ached. "Yes," I said softly, "but perhaps they wait for us to listen first." As the kingdom weakened, local lords rose from the dust, calling themselves kings. They built their own tombs, their own laws, their own tiny dreams of eternity. But the unity that once bound us, that single golden thread from the river to the stars, was fraying. I watched from a cliff above the floodplain one evening. The sun set behind the pyramids, their tips catching the last red light, and I thought, even the longest day must fall into shadow. Do you ever wonder how greatness fades? Not with thunder, but with silence? The fall of an age is not a single moment, but a slow forgetting, a loosening of faith, a dimming of care, a river drying grain by grain. And yet, even then, the stars came out above the desert, bright and indifferent as always. The same stars that had watched Khufu build, that had seen Djoser dream, that had glowed over the first flood of memory. They reminded me that no kingdom truly dies. It only changes form. The stories remain. The stones endure. And as long as one voice still remembers, Egypt breathes. So sleep now, traveler. Let the silence of the desert wrap around you like linen. The river may rest, the fields may fade, but the dream of balance, Ma'at, still whispers beneath the sand. Listen for it. It is the soft sound of time forgiving itself. Dawn came slowly to Egypt. Not in a single sunrise, but in the long, patient way light returns after many nights. For years, the land had known only silence. Temples closed, kings forgotten. The river's song too faint to hear. But nothing stays lost forever. Even the sun must rise again. I had wandered through those shadowed years, writing what little there was to remember. A famine survived, a kindness offered, a burial done without gold but not without love. Then one morning I heard a rumor carried by merchants from the south. "A man has come," they said. "A man who listens to the river, who seeks to make Egypt whole again." His name was Mentuhotep, a king from Thebes, young, solemn, with eyes that saw both sorrow and possibility. He spoke softly, but when he did, the air around him stilled as if the wind itself leaned closer to listen. Do you ever meet someone whose calm feels stronger than armies? That was how he seemed. Mentuhotep did not rebuild with gold or fire. He rebuilt with patience. He walked among farmers, restored temples not for vanity but for gratitude, and reopened the shrines of the gods who had waited in darkness. He called himself the Uniters of the Two Lands, and for the first time in generations, that title felt true again. I remember standing on the banks of the Nile as his procession passed. Priests in white linen carried sacred boats, their oars glinting in the morning sun. Children threw petals onto the water. Behind them, soldiers marched not in conquest but in rhythm, a steady heartbeat returning to the land. The river rose that year, higher than it had in decades. The people said the gods had forgiven us, but I wondered if it was not forgiveness we had received, but understanding. For even the Nile, generous as it was, needed time to rest before flowing again. Do you ever think of renewal as something that grows quietly, like a seed beneath the soil waiting for its season? That was Egypt then, a wounded seed finding the courage to sprout again. Under Mentuhotep's rule, new artists emerged. Sculptors carved faces not just of kings, but of farmers, soldiers, and scribes. Ordinary men made eternal in stone. It was as if Egypt had learned humility from its suffering. The grand pyramids were gone, but in their place rose temples that breathed with human warmth. At Deir el-Bahari, they built terraces that caught the morning light, each level opening to the next like a stairway for the soul. I wrote on fresh papyrus that day, my ink still dark from the night's mixing. "The light has returned," I wrote. "It does not blaze, it hums." When I met the new priests of Thebes, they no longer spoke of wrathful gods demanding obedience. Instead, they spoke of balance, of wisdom, of the heart's weight against truth. They said the gods had not vanished. We had simply stopped listening. Each night, I sat beside the river again. The stars shimmered like grains of sand scattered across the black sky. I could hear frogs singing, water birds calling, and in those sounds I felt the pulse of Egypt's soul awakening. One evening, a young apprentice sat beside me. He asked, "Master, how do we know when an age is ending?" I looked at the river and smiled. "When people begin to dream again," I said, "and their dreams are not of what was lost, but of what might still be." He nodded, eyes bright with belief. In that moment I felt something stir, not just in him but in the land itself. Hope reborn. Have you ever felt the warmth of the first sunlight after a long night of rain? That was Egypt under the new kings. Not triumphant, not proud, but peaceful in its breathing. And as the river flowed again, I dipped my reed in ink and whispered to the wind, "May we remember this lesson, that even darkness has its purpose, for it teaches us to love the dawn." So close your eyes, traveler. The sun has risen once more over Thebes. You can almost hear the chants from the terraces, soft and steady as the heartbeat of the earth. Let that rhythm carry you. Let it remind you, nothing truly ends. It only waits to begin again. The kingdom was breathing again. The famine had faded into memory, and with the return of abundance came something even rarer, the return of beauty. The kings of the Middle Kingdom did not seek to outshine their ancestors with taller monuments. They sought to understand the soul. Their palaces were smaller, their temples quieter, but inside those walls, the light of creation burned brighter than ever. I had taken up my reed once more, its tip polished smooth by years of use. They called me Keeper of Words, a title I had worn before, though I never tired of hearing it whispered in the echoing halls of stone. Do you ever feel that joy? The kind that comes not from glory but from craft? The still, silent joy of making something that will outlast your hands? That was my joy then. In Thebes, I taught new scribes how to mix ink, how to grind ochre and soot into the perfect balance of red and black. The black was for the world of men, the red for the world of gods. Every line we wrote was a bridge between them. We sat in long rows beneath the colonnades, our scrolls spread like wings before us. The young scribes bent their heads over their work, their lips moving silently as they traced hieroglyphs, those sacred shapes that danced between picture and word. When their lines were true, I smiled. When they trembled, I reminded them. Steady hands begin with steady hearts. Do you write, traveler? Even now, with tools of glass and light instead of reed and ink, you are not so different from us. Each word you trace is a prayer, a promise to be remembered. In those days, stories bloomed like lotus flowers. We wrote tales of journeys and justice, of wise kings and foolish men, of love found and lost beside the river's edge. One story told of a sailor shipwrecked on an island of gold, who spoke to a great serpent that promised him safe passage home. Another spoke of a farmer who argued for his stolen grain, with such eloquence that even the gods paused to listen. These were not the words of kings, but of ordinary souls, and that, perhaps, was their beauty. We had learned that eternity does not belong only to those who rule, but also to those who remember. Each evening when the work was done, I dipped my brush into clean water and washed away the day's ink. The water turned black for a moment, then clear again. A small act of purification, a promise to begin anew. I would step outside into the amber dusk, and the air smelled of oil lamps and warm stone. Beyond the walls, the Nile shimmered, its surface gold and blue like the scales of a living god. Once a young scribe asked me, "Master, what do we write for?" I thought for a long while before answering. "We write so that silence may not win." He looked puzzled, but I saw in his eyes the same hunger that had lived in mine for 1,000 years, the hunger to give shape to time. Art flourished in every corner of the kingdom. Sculptors carved faces filled with quiet dignity. Painters covered tombs with gardens, boats, and lovers, not to mourn the dead but to remind them of life. Musicians tuned harps to the rhythm of the wind through lotus leaves. And in every creation I saw the same truth reflected, that the divine is not far from us. It breathes through the hands that create. Do you ever feel that when you make something beautiful, that trembling between self and eternity? We felt it every day. And so, under the calm rule of Amenemhat and Senusret, Egypt became a symphony again, not of conquest but of harmony. We called it the Age of Ma'at restored. At night I would lie on the roof of my home, watching the stars drift over Thebes. Each one felt like a word, a note, a spark of memory. And I thought, perhaps heaven itself is just the sky remembering us. The wind moved softly through the papyrus groves, and I whispered a line into the dark. What is written in truth never fades. Close your eyes, traveler. You can almost hear the brush against the scroll, the gentle rhythm of ink and breath, the heartbeat of a civilization finding its voice again. Let that sound carry you, steady, slow, eternal, into dreams of gold and light. The Middle Kingdom grew strong, like a tree once broken that now spread its branches wide again. The river flowed steady, the fields shimmered with grain, and Egypt, my eternal Egypt, remembered how to dream of greatness once more. I was older now, though my face was not always the same. Time had changed me as it changes the riverbank, slowly, patiently shaping my edges with each return. Yet my task remained unchanged, to record, to witness, to keep the flame of memory from fading. Do you ever feel the weight of peace, traveler? Not the silence of stillness, but the deep, calm breath that comes after struggle? That was Egypt then. Not restless, not triumphant, but balanced, radiant, alive. The kings of this age called themselves lords of the two horizons. They stood between earth and sun, their temples facing east to greet the dawn, and west to honor the dying light. It was said that their rule bridged both worlds, the living and the divine. I served under King Senusret, a man both scholar and warrior. He rode north to secure the delta, and south to the lands of Nubia, where dark cliffs rose from the river like sleeping giants. He built fortresses there, not only of stone but of friendship. Trade flowed with the gold and ebony of the southern lands, and with it came new songs, new languages, new faces that shone like the desert sun. I remember one journey southward. We sailed for weeks, the wind at our backs, the papyrus sails whispering like old scrolls. At night, the stars seemed closer, so near that I thought if I reached out, I might touch them and feel them hum. Do you ever travel under a night sky so clear that you forget which world you belong to? That was how it felt on the river between kingdoms. In Nubia, I met craftsmen who carved ivory as delicate as breath, and women whose laughter rang through the valley like silver bells. They spoke of their own gods, but when I told them of Ra, of Osiris, of the journey of the soul, they listened and nodded. Your sun is our sun, one elder said. Your river is our river. Perhaps the gods share the same water, and only we give them different names. I wrote his words down, knowing they carried a truth even kings seldom grasped, that no border could divide the rhythm of the Nile. Under the kings of the two horizons, Egypt built again with quiet confidence. Temples rose at Karnak and Luxor, filled not with arrogance but devotion. The inscriptions no longer screamed power, they whispered gratitude. In those temples I carved hymns to the sun's journey, to dawn the birth of light, to noon the height of truth, to dusk the gentle descent of wisdom. I wrote, he rises and we are born. He sets and we remember. And I believed it, for each day as the sun crossed the sky, it carried our hopes on its back, burning them into gold, then cooling them into peace. Once as I stood in the court of Senusret's temple, a young soldier approached me. He had fought in the southern campaign, his face scarred, his eyes too old for his years. He asked, Scribe, do the gods see us when we fight? I looked at him and said, they see what endures after we stop fighting, the way we rebuild, the way we remember. He nodded slowly, and I could see his shoulders ease, as if the burden of war had become lighter. The kings of this time understood that lesson. They ruled not with fear but with foresight. They built schools beside temples, taught scribes to write not just for the dead, but for the living, letters of trade, of love, of poetry. It was said that a man who knew how to write could speak to eternity. Do you ever think of words that way? As small boats carrying your thoughts beyond your own lifetime? That was what writing meant to us. In the evenings, I would walk among the temple shadows, listening to the hum of bees settling in the lotus fields. The air smelled of oil lamps and warm sandstone, and as the sun slipped behind the western hills, the statues of kings glowed red for a moment, as if the gods themselves were touching their faces in farewell. Egypt was whole again, its two lands bound not by conquest, but by understanding. The horizon stretched endless, and for the first time in many lifetimes, I felt content. Close your eyes, traveler. Imagine the sun dipping low, its light washing over the stone colonnades of Thebes. The air cools, the river hums softly, and the earth itself seems to whisper, all is balanced, all is one. There comes a moment, even in the brightest of ages, when the light begins to lean toward shadow. Not suddenly, not cruelly, just gently, as if the sun itself sighs. So it was with Egypt. After centuries of harmony, the voices of the kings grew softer. Their temples still stood, their statues still shone, but the certainty that once guided them began to waver. I, who had written for so many rulers, heard the hesitation in their words before they did. Do you know how silence begins, traveler? It begins not with absence, but with the slowing of belief. The court at Storie was still magnificent, filled with music, gold, and the scent of lotus oil. But beneath its beauty, I could feel the air tightening. Scribes whispered of missing caravans, of border tribes no longer paying tribute, of temples slow to receive offerings. The river still flowed, yet its floods were less generous, its rhythm uncertain. In the great hall, the new pharaoh spoke of prosperity, but his voice echoed against the stone too long, as if the walls themselves were unconvinced. He was not cruel, only weary, a man born into peace, who had never learned the art of vigilance. He loved poetry more than war, and sometimes when the council tired him, he would summon me to his garden to read. I remember one evening, as dusk melted into the blue of night, he asked, "Tell me, scribe, do you think my name will live forever?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I thought of Djoser, Khufu, Mentuhotep, Senusret, names carved deep into the skin of the earth. And I answered truthfully, "Majesty, even stone forgets in time, but kindness remembers longer than power." He smiled faintly, and for a moment, the heaviness in his gaze lifted. Do you ever wonder, traveler, how history forgets not through malice, but through fatigue? Even memory grows tired. Even faith must rest. As the decades passed, local lords grew bold again. They raised their own banners, their own shrines, their own small gods. The unity that once bound Egypt began to fray like old linen left too long in the sun. Yet the people endured. Farmers still followed the floods. Craftsmen still shaped beauty from clay and gold, and children still laughed along the riverbanks. Civilization does not end with a crash. It drifts, like a boat untied from its mooring, carried away by a current too gentle to resist. I wrote less during those years. Perhaps I was tired too. But sometimes when the moon was full, I would climb the roof of my house and look toward the pyramids, their edges softened by time, their meaning still immense. They stood not as monuments to kings, but as reminders that even silence has a heartbeat. Once a young apprentice came to me, worried that our craft was dying. "No one values words anymore," he said. "They care only for gold." I smiled. "Then write that down," I told him. "When the world forgets why we write, that is precisely when we must write the most." He did. And so another hand took up the brush. Do you see the pattern, traveler? Empires rise, and fall, and rise again. But the act of remembering never truly ends. When the last of the Middle Kingdom pharaohs was laid to rest, there were no grand processions, no thunder of drums, only a quiet line of mourners, and the whisper of sand over the tomb. The priest sealed his chamber, the torches went out, and darkness filled the air like dust. But beyond the tomb walls, in a small house near the river, I sat by lamplight, writing these words upon a scroll. Though kings may sleep, Egypt still dreams. Close your eyes now, traveler. The lamps are fading, and the desert night grows cool. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the stars keep their silent watch, and beneath them, the pharaohs dream without fear, their names carried on the breath of ink and sand. The wind came from the north that year, dry and sharp, carrying with it the scent of smoke and iron. We had known peace for so long, that even the sound of distant hooves felt unnatural, like thunder in a temple. I was an old man then, or perhaps an old soul wearing yet another face. I had seen kingdoms fade and rise again, but this was different. Egypt had never bowed before another, until now. They came from the delta, foreigners with strange tongues and sharper tools. Their chariots cut across the sand like living beasts, Their armor gleamed like scales of a serpent. The people called them Hika Kasut, the rulers of foreign lands. In time, the name would become Hyksos. Do you know what fear sounds like, traveler? It does not scream. It whispers, low and trembling, as if afraid of hearing itself. Villages emptied before the invaders arrived. Temples closed their gates. I saw priests carry statues of the gods into the desert, hiding them among the cliffs, as if the divine needed protection. In the south, Thebes still held strong, its kings proud though weakened. But in the north, foreign banners waved over Memphis. For the first time, Egypt was ruled by strangers. I remained because someone had to remember. In the halls where pharaohs once sat, I now heard foreign accents echo. They brought new gods, strange rituals, and coins instead of offerings. The scribes still worked, but our ink felt heavier, as though it carried grief instead of knowledge. One evening, a Hyksos overseer entered my chamber. He spoke Egyptian clumsily, but with unexpected respect. "You write of kings," he said. "Now you will write of us." I bowed but said nothing, because how do you write of those who build without understanding the soul of what they touch? He placed a scroll before me, a list of taxes, names of those who must pay tribute. The ink blurred beneath my trembling hand. I wanted to write a prayer instead. Do you ever feel torn between truth and duty? Between what you must record and what your heart refuses to see? That was my burden then. Yet even amid conquest, life went on. Farmers still rose at dawn. Wives still baked bread. Children still played by the river, their laughter echoing against the broken walls. The Nile did not care who called themselves king. It rose and fell as it always had, and I found comfort in that constancy. In Thebes, whispers began to stir. Of rebellion, of pride rekindled. There were still men who remembered what it meant to stand beneath their own flag, to speak their gods' names aloud without fear. I traveled there under nightfall, through fields gone silent except for the frogs' chorus. At the edge of the city, I met an old priest. His robes were worn, his hands cracked with age, but his eyes burned bright as the desert stars. "They have taken our crowns," he said, "but not our memory, and memory is what makes kings." Those words lodged in my heart like a seed, because I knew memory endures when power does not. And perhaps that is why I had been reborn so many times, to keep Egypt's memory alive when her voice faltered. That night, as I wrote by the dim light of an oil lamp, I heard distant drums from the north, the rhythm of foreign celebration, and beneath it, faint but steady, the hum of Thebes awakening. Do you ever feel hope bloom quietly in the dark? It's fragile at first, like the first sprout after drought, or the first star after sunset, but it's there waiting. I closed my scroll, set down my reed, and whispered to the wind. The strangers may rule for a season, but Egypt remembers her name. The desert answered in its own language, a soft sigh of moving sand. And I knew then, this was not an ending, only the gathering of strength before dawn. So rest now, traveler. The night is long, but even under foreign stars, the Nile still flows, and the gods still listen. The night had lasted too long. Years of silence, years of foreign tongues echoing through our temples. But even darkness, however deep, trembles before the whisper of dawn. That whisper began in Thebes. I had returned there, an old scribe with ink-stained fingers, and eyes that had seen too many kings fade into dust. Thebes was smaller now, but its heart beat strong beneath the quiet surface. You could hear it in the songs of the workers by the river, in the murmur of priests sweeping the temple floors. Egypt was not dead, only sleeping. Have you ever stood at the edge of morning and felt the first light before it touches your skin? That was Thebes then, a city waiting to wake. The call came from a man named Sekenenra, a king, yes, but one who wore his crown lightly. He spoke not of vengeance, but of balance, of Ma'at, broken and yearning to be made whole again. His words spread quietly through the south, like the sound of water returning to a dry channel. The Hyksos still ruled in the north, their chariots fast, their soldiers ruthless. They built fortresses and demanded tribute, but they did not understand the soul of the Nile. You can command the land for a time, but you cannot command its memory. Sekenenra sent envoys north, bearing gifts and words of diplomacy, but the Hyksos ruler mocked him. He sent a message, a letter so absurd that it was meant as insult. It demanded that the hippos in Thebes be silenced, for their cries disturbed his sleep in faraway avarice. I was there when the letter was read aloud. The court fell silent, then broke into murmurs of disbelief. Sekenenra smiled, not with anger but with something colder, wiser. "If their dreams are troubled by our river," he said softly, "then perhaps Egypt still speaks in their sleep." From that moment, resistance was no longer a secret. Men trained by torchlight in the desert, priests blessed weapons with holy oil, and I, the old scribe, recorded their names on scrolls that would one day outlive them all. Do you believe in destiny, traveler? That invisible current pulling us toward what must be? We felt it then, a tide rising not from the sea, but from the soul of a wounded land. Sekenenra fought bravely, but war is cruel even to the noble. He fell in battle, his skull shattered, his body carried home beneath the wails of flutes. I helped wrap his wounds myself, my tears staining the linen. We buried him with honor, not as a king defeated, but as a seed planted in blood and memory. From that seed another rose, Chamos, fierce as the desert wind. He struck north like the arrow of Are, his chariots blazing across the sand. I followed his army, riding by the flicker of campfires, my scrolls smelling of smoke and dust. Every victory he won I marked with the same line. The Nile remembers. But it was Amos, brother of Chamos, who would finish what they began. He was still young when the crown found him, yet his eyes held the calm of a man who listened more than he spoke. He united the south and marched northward, not in hatred, but in the name of restoration. I saw the final battle from the hills above Avaris. The air was filled with the scream of horses, the flash of bronze beneath the sun. When the dust cleared, Egypt was free again. Do you know what freedom sounds like? It is not shouting. It is silence. A silence so deep that the heart dares to hope again. That night, Amos stood before his men, the moon reflecting in his eyes like the river itself. He said, "The gods have not returned to us. We have returned to them." And I wrote those words in gold ink, because I knew they would live forever. Thebes sang again. Drums echoed through the valleys, temples reopened their doors, and the river, generous as ever, rose higher than anyone remembered. It was as if the gods themselves had wept with joy. As I watched the sunrise from the temple steps, I thought of every king I had served, every name I had written, every dawn I had seen rise and fall, and I whispered to the light, "Egypt has found her breath again." Do you feel it, traveler? That warmth spreading through the air? The peace after a long storm? That is Thebes reborn, its people awake, its spirit unbroken. So close your eyes. Let the golden wind of the south brush your cheek. The strangers are gone. The river flows freely once more. And Egypt, eternal and forgiving, dreams in sunlight again. The dawn that rose after the Hyksos fell was brighter than any I had seen in lifetimes. It was not the timid light of recovery, but the full blaze of triumph. Egypt reborn, proud and radiant. They called it the New Kingdom. And truly it felt new. New temples, new kings, new dreams carved into the desert stone. I, the Eternal Scribe, was once again summoned to record the rising sun. Thebes had become the heart of empire, its palaces wide as river deltas, its columns tall enough to cradle the sky. Everywhere you could hear the rhythm of hammers, the murmur of prayers, the hum of life expanding. Have you ever stood in a city so alive that even its silence seems to sing? That was Thebes then. Amos had restored freedom, but it was his heirs who turned freedom into glory. Thutmose the Great, his name strong as the sun. He marched beyond the sands, crossing the borders that once held Egypt in. The world itself seemed to open before his chariots. Syria, Canaan, Nubia, all shimmering in the dust of his victories. I followed the army once, my scroll tied to my belt, my ink jar clinking softly against my chest. The nights were cold in the desert, but the fires of conquest burned hot. The soldiers sang beneath the stars, not of blood, but of home, of wives, of fields, of the river waiting for them. Do you ever think of glory, traveler, and realize it is never about gold, but about belonging? That was what Egypt's warriors fought for, not expansion but remembrance. When we returned to Thebes, the city glittered with offerings. Temples rose in honor of Ammonius, the hidden god made visible again. Priests walked in processions of white and gold, their voices echoing through the courtyards like wind through reeds. The scent of incense floated above the streets, sweet and thick as honey. And among all these kings and gods, there was one whose presence changed everything. A woman. Her name was Hatshepsut, daughter of kings, mother of ambition, queen who called herself Pharaoh. I served her closely, and I tell you this, her power did not roar. It whispered, like the Nile when it overflows, steady, unstoppable, patient. She ruled not through war, but through wisdom and trade. Under her, ships sailed beyond the Red Sea, to lands of myrrh and ivory, bringing home perfumes, trees, and stories. The desert bloomed with stone, temples carved into cliffs, columns shaped like lotus stalks lifting toward the sun. At Deir el-Bahari, I watched her dream take form. Layer by layer, her temple rose, its terraces catching the morning light, like a staircase built for the soul. She called it Jezer, the Holy of Holies. And when the wind swept across its courtyards, it sounded like the ocean of time breathing. Do you ever feel pride not for yourself, but for what you've witnessed? That was how I felt standing before her work, as if I had seen Egypt's heart laid bare in stone. Yet time as always brings change. When Hatshepsut's reign ended, her name was chiseled away by those who feared her legacy. I was ordered to erase her from the scrolls. My hand trembled as I obeyed, but as I ground the ink, I whispered her name into the water, and I knew no blade could cut what memory keeps alive. Then came Amenhotep, builder of temples so vast that their shadows cooled the earth. His son, Thutmose IV, dreamed of the Sphinx speaking to him, promising kingship, and later still another Amenhotep, who would call himself Akhenaten, and move the capital to the desert, to chase a single god across the sky. But that is a story for another night. As I look back upon those golden years, I remember not their conquests, but their harmony, the hum of artisans at dawn, the laughter of scribes sharing dates and bread, the rustle of linen in temple corridors, the way sunlight moved through the halls of Karnak, like a living spirit blessing all it touched. Egypt had become what it was always meant to be, a mirror of heaven. Do you feel it, traveler? That warmth beneath your ribs, the soft weight of peace and pride? That is the empire's heartbeat, slow, golden, endless. Close your eyes now. The sand is warm beneath you. The air tastes faintly of frankincense and honey. Somewhere beyond the dunes, the builders still sing, and the empire of gold still glows beneath the eternal sun. The air in Thebes had grown heavy, not with dust, but with doubt. For generations, the temples of Ammonius had ruled as much as kings did. The gods' priests whispered in palaces, counted gold heavier than truth, and the people bowed to their power as much as to the pharaoh. And then came the boy who changed everything, Amenhotep IV, soft-spoken, thoughtful, eyes that always seemed to be watching the horizon rather than the crowd before him. I was there when he first spoke of his vision. He said the gods were too many, their voices too loud, their demands endless. He dreamed of a single light, a single source, the sun itself, the Aten. Have you ever looked at the sunrise and felt, just for a moment, that the world is being born again? That was how he described his God. Not hidden like Ammonius, not distant like Osiris, but shining openly on every living thing. The court murmured, the priest frowned, but the boy king smiled. He said, if the gods fear the sun, perhaps it is because they know it reveals all. And so began the great transformation. He changed his name, from Amenhotep, satisfied with Ammonius, to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten. He ordered new temples built, open to the sky, without roofs or shadows, so that the sun could fall directly upon the altars. I walked among the builders, my sandals sinking into the hot sand, and I wondered, was this heresy or revelation? He moved the capital north, away from Thebes and its priests, to a barren stretch of desert by the Nile. He called it Akkadian, the horizon of the sun, a city built from nothing, rising in a place where even the wind hesitated. Have you ever seen a city being born? Not over years, but in weeks, stone by stone, voice by voice, as if the earth itself had begun to hum a new song. That's what Amarna became, a hymn in limestone. The king and his queen, Nefertiti, walked among the people without fear. She was radiant, not with jewels, but with presence. The two of them stood together beneath the blazing disk, hands raised not to many gods, but to one light. I watched as artists changed their style, faces no longer idealized, but real. You could see wrinkles, laughter lines, the curve of a child's belly. The royal family was shown playing, embracing, living, as if divinity itself had grown human. For a time, Egypt glowed differently, softer, closer to the heart. But whispers are shadows, and they return even in the brightest day. The priests of Ammonius plotted in silence. The nobles grumbled of tradition betrayed, and the people, weary of change, began to long for the comfort of the old ways. Akhenaten prayed longer each day. Sometimes I would see him standing alone at dawn, his thin frame trembling in the wind, eyes fixed on the rising sun. His face would soften, and he would whisper words I could not hear. Do you think a man can love an idea too much? So much that he forgets the world around him? Perhaps that was his curse. When his daughter fell ill, no priest of Ammonius would come. He prayed to the Aten, offering gold, incense, tears. But the sun, bright and indifferent, gave no answer. Soon after, the queen was gone from public life. Whether by death or distance, none could say. The city that had been filled with laughter grew quiet. The temples, still roofless, echoed only with wind. I continued to write, but the ink felt colder now. Every word seemed like a shadow stretched too far. When Akhenaten died, they buried him in his new city, but already the people whispered of return, to Thebes, to Ammonius, to the old gods who had never truly left. And so the sun set on his dream. The city of light became a ghost before the dust had settled. His name was erased, his images defaced, his memory condemned to silence. But not by me, because I remember. And so he still lives, in ink, in breath, in the golden light that touches every dawn. Do you see it now, traveler? The way the morning sun paints your wall in gold? That's him, still reaching across time, still trying to remind us that light, however brief, is never truly lost. So rest now. Let the warmth of Aten lull you to sleep. Dream of a city built from sunlight and love, where even gods dared to walk among men. The city of the sun was gone. Its stones lay scattered across the desert, its altars swallowed by sand. The priests of Ammonius returned to Thebes, their chants once more echoing through the sacred halls. Egypt, weary of revolution, sought comfort in the familiar, and in that fragile dawn, a boy became king. His name was Tutankhaten, living image of Aten, but soon the name changed. He became Tutankhamen, living image of Ammonius. The sun god was set aside, the old gods came home, and Egypt exhaled, as if it had been holding its breath for years. I was old then, my hands unsteady, my sight dim as twilight, yet I was asked once again to write, to record the reign of the boy who restored balance. He was gentle, curious, with a face still soft from youth. When he spoke, his voice carried no pride, only wonder. He liked to walk through temple corridors at dawn, touching the carved names of kings who came before him. Do you think they remember us? He asked me once. Those who lie beneath the sand? I told him, only if we remember them first. He smiled, that same innocent, weary smile, of one born into duty too soon. Do you ever think about how heavy a crown must feel on the head of a child? The court around him was not so kind. Two men guided his every step, I the vizier, and Horemheb the general. Both were powerful, both waiting for the day their turn would come. The boy was king, but his throne was built from whispers. Still there was peace. Temples reopened. Statues of Ammonius gleamed once more beneath the sun. Artists worked tirelessly, restoring what had been broken, painting the gods as if to reawaken them from long sleep. And amid this restoration, the boy king found love in Kessenamen, daughter of Nefertiti, raised like him in a world of shifting fates. I saw them once, sitting by a lotus pond, their hands brushing the water, their laughter light as wind through papyrus reeds. For a moment, it felt as if Egypt itself had smiled again. But the gods, it seems, envy joy that is too pure. In his 19th year, the young pharaoh fell ill. Some said it was a broken leg that festered. Others whispered of a curse, a punishment from the jealous gods of the past. I think it was simply time. as sudden and unmerciful as the desert sun. We carried him to Thebes. Priests wrapped his body in linen. Each layer whispered with prayers. Perfume filled the air. Myrrh, cedar, lotus. The scent of farewell. I wrote his final cartouche, my trembling hand carving each symbol slowly. Tutankhamun, lord of the two lands, beloved of Ammonius, who lived briefly but shines eternally. His tomb was small, too small for a king, but perhaps the gods chose it that way. Hidden deep in the Valley of Kings, it escaped the greed of thieves and the ruin of centuries. Have you ever thought how strange it is that the smallest places sometimes hold the greatest treasures? 3,000 years later, men from another age would find him again. Howard Carter and his lantern of dust and wonder, when he broke the seal and peered into that golden chamber, he whispered, "Yes, wonderful things." And Tutankhamun awoke once more, not in flesh, but in memory, his face gleaming beneath the glass of museums, his name spoken by millions who never knew him. He who ruled for less than a decade became immortal in a way no conqueror ever could. As I close the scroll, I feel something soft stir in the air, a warmth, a whisper, perhaps the boy himself smiling through the ages. Do you hear it too, traveler? That faint hum, like the echo of gold against stone? That is eternity breathing. That is Tutankhamun's heart still beating in the dark. Close your eyes. Let the desert wind cool your skin. Imagine the flicker of lamplight upon treasure untouched, the silence of the tomb, the peace of a story complete. Sleep now, as kings do, beneath the watchful stars, wrapped in the soft linen of history. The wind over Pyramus carries the sound of hoofbeats, thousands of horses training at dawn. The air smells of sweat, bronze, and sand. And in the midst of it all, a king standing in the chariot's stirrups, his golden crown glinting like fire. Ramesses, son of Seti, beloved of Are, pharaoh of 100 temples, the man the world would call the Great. I met him first as a young prince, barefoot in the palace garden, shooting arrows at clay targets. He was not yet king, but already the sun seemed to follow him. Even as a boy, he spoke of his destiny as if it were already carved in stone. Egypt is eternal, he told me once, and I will make it visible. And so he did. When his father died, Ramesses took the double crown, and the empire trembled with energy. He built cities, raised temples, filled the land with statues that looked like himself. Some said it was vanity. I think it was longing, the same longing all mortals share, to be remembered. Do you ever wonder what it feels like to stand before the mirror of eternity and see your own reflection carved in stone? His greatest temple rose in the south, Abu Simbel. I was there when the first blocks were cut, each stone the size of a chariot, each stroke of the chisel a prayer. The workers sang in rhythm, their songs echoing through the cliffs of Nubia, and slowly the mountain itself took on the face of a god. Four colossal figures, each the image of Ramesses, seated on thrones of silence. They gazed east, so that each dawn, the first light of the sun would touch their cheeks, a conversation between Ra and his living son. Even now, traveler, if you close your eyes, you can almost feel that moment, the golden light spilling across the sand, the river glinting below, and the world holding its breath, for a man who believed he could outlast time. But even the gods of stone must face war. In the 5th year of his reign, the north burned with conflict. The Hittites were rising, a power vast and cunning. They held the city of Kadesh, and Ramesses would not allow it. He led his army north, for divisions of men and chariots, the banners of Egypt fluttering like flames. I rode with the scribes, recording each step of that long journey through the desert. We crossed the Orontes River under a sky heavy with dust, believing victory was near. But war has its own gods. Our scouts had been deceived. The Hittite army lay hidden beyond the hills, their chariots waiting in silence. When the trap closed, it was chaos. The chariots thundered down, dust and screams filling the air. Men scattered, horses bolted, and even the bravest hearts faltered. Then, through the storm, I saw him, Ramesses, alone, driving his chariot straight into the enemy ranks. His bow sang like lightning. His voice roared above the din. I am Ramesses. I am Egypt. There was madness. There was glory. and somehow it turned the tide. By sunset, the Hittites withdrew. Neither side had truly won, but Egypt had not fallen, and that was enough to make legends. Years later, when peace came, a treaty was written, the first in human history. Two great empires agreeing to coexist, their seals pressed into silver, their words echoing across time. A good brotherhood is established, peace shall endure forever, and Ramesses built again. Temples, cities, obelisks, his name carved deeper into the earth than any before him. At Karnak, his statues lined the avenues. At Luxor, his columns reached for the heavens. Everywhere, his face watched the living. Do you feel it, traveler? That quiet pride beneath the sand? That's him, still standing, still guarding Egypt. His empire shimmering in the heat like a mirage that never fades. When he died, the mourners filled the land from delta to desert. His body was wrapped in linen and gold, placed in a tomb vast enough for a god. I was there when they sealed it, the torches flickering, the scent of resin thick in the air, a silence so profound it felt like the world itself had paused to listen. May he live forever, whispered the priests, and in a way he did, because even now, as the centuries flow like the Nile itself, his name remains on our tongues. Ramesses the Great, the king who built for eternity. Close your eyes now. Imagine the sound of distant drums, the rustle of banners in the wind, the steady rhythm of hooves fading into the horizon. That is the heartbeat of empire. That is Egypt, still awake, still shining in the dreams of time. The statues of Ramesses still stood. Their eyes faced the sunrise as they always had, but the light that touched them now felt weaker. The air over Thebes grew dry. The river's voice softened. The empire that once sang like the sun itself had begun to whisper. After Ramesses the Great, there came another and another, 13 sons of his line, each crowned in the shadow of his father's greatness. Their names echoed with divinity, but their hands trembled with age. Even kings can grow weary of eternity. I, the Eternal Scribe, watched as scrolls became shorter, as offerings became fewer, as prayers began to fade before reaching the temple doors. The treasury was empty. The gold that once gilded statues was melted to pay soldiers. The workers at Deir el-Medina, the men who built the tombs of the gods, laid down their chisels. For the first time in memory, they went on strike. Can you imagine that, traveler? The builders of immortality refusing to work, because even eternity must eat. They waited outside the temple gates, voices calm, demanding only the bread and beer owed to them. The storerooms are empty, a priest confessed. The granaries half full. And so Egypt, eternal, divine Egypt, negotiated with its own children for survival. Beyond the borders, storms gathered. The Libyans pressed from the west. Strange warriors from the sea raided the delta, and the Hittites, once mighty, vanished beneath the same tide that now threatened us. The world was shifting. Even the gods seemed quieter. The Nile, our lifeline, no longer rose as high. The floods grew thin. Harvests failed. Famine followed. And with it, desperation. I wrote the records myself. The price of grain tripled. Temple storerooms looted. Families selling amulets for food. And through it all, the priests still sang to Ammonius, their voices echoing off empty walls. Do you ever wonder what it sounds like when a civilization sighs? It isn't thunder, or war drums, or screams. It's quieter than that. A slow, aching silence, between prayers unanswered. Then came Ramesses III, the last to bear that proud name. He fought bravely, repelled the sea peoples, rebuilt the temples, restored faith for a moment. But victory has its cost. The treasury drained again, and corruption bloomed like weeds after rain. I saw it with my own eyes. Scribes falsifying accounts, officials stealing rations, priests whispering in secret chambers. Even the tombs of the kings were robbed by those sworn to protect them. The gods turned away, or perhaps we simply stopped listening. When Ramesses III was murdered, his throat cut in a conspiracy of his own harem, I wrote the trial records with shaking hands. They called it evil magic, but I think it was something older, simpler. The hunger of power when faith is gone. After him, the line of kings thinned, the empire's edges frayed. The two lands that once ruled from Nubia to the sea split like a cracked mirror. In the north, rulers of Libyan blood took the throne. In the south, the high priests of Ammonius ruled from Thebes, not in the king's name, but their own. Egypt had become what it once feared, divided, weary, and old. And yet, even in ruin, there was beauty. I would walk at dusk along the riverbanks, past the ruins of temples where lotus still bloomed. The fishermen still sang. Children still played in the shallows. Life, stubborn, patient, refused to fade. Have you ever noticed, traveler, how even broken things can still shine in the right light? That was Egypt then, cracked but luminous. One night, as I watched the stars reflected in the Nile, a young acolyte sat beside me. He asked, "Will Egypt die?" I looked at the water, at the reflection of constellations older than any king, and said, "No, Egypt does not die. It changes its name, and waits to be remembered." And so I kept writing, through the silence, through the storms, through the long twilight of empire. Do you feel it now? That gentle sadness between heartbeats? That is the sound of endings, and beginnings disguised as loss. Close your eyes. The sand is cool now. The river glimmers faintly in the dark. The kings sleep. The gods dream. And Egypt, though broken, still breathes beneath the stars. The wind across Thebes had changed. It no longer carried the scent of incense and lotus, but dust, fine, dry, foreign. The empire of Ramesses was gone. In its place stood fragments, kingdoms of sand and silence. The priests of Ammonius still ruled the south, their hymns echoing through empty temples, while in the north, new voices spoke in strange tongues. The Libyans had come, first as mercenaries, then as kings. I remember the first of them, Sheshank, a soldier who became pharaoh. He wore the double crown with dignity, and though his blood was foreign, his heart belonged to Egypt. He spoke our language with a careful accent, prayed in our temples, and made offerings to Ammonius as any son of the Nile would. "Does the river ask who drinks from it?" he said once, smiling. "It gives to all." He was right. Egypt had always absorbed the world. The Nubians, the Asiatics, the Greeks who came to trade. We took their words, their crafts, their gods, and made them ours. Perhaps that was our truest gift, to endure not by resistance, but by remembrance. Under Sheshank, the armies marched again, not for conquest, but for restoration. He sent chariots into Canaan, carved his victories into temple walls, and for a brief moment, Egypt's pulse quickened once more. But time, like the desert, does not rest. After him came kings who ruled not from Thebes, but from the Delta, from Tanis, cities of mud and reed where the language of power was spoken softly in whispers. In the south, a new kingdom rose, Cush, in the land once called Nubia. Its rulers were dark-skinned, proud, and steeped in the faith Egypt had taught them long ago. They built temples to Ammonius, spoke in hieroglyphs, and buried their kings beneath pyramids, smaller but no less sacred. I traveled there once, across the golden dunes to Nepeta, where the Nile bends like a serpent of green glass. The Cushite priests greeted me as brother. They said, "We have not stolen Egypt. We have preserved her." And in their eyes I saw truth. Their king, Put, marched north not as a conqueror, but as a restorer. His banners bore not foreign emblems, but the familiar plumes of Ammonius. When he entered Thebes, the people wept with joy. "The son of the south has returned," they cried. "Egypt is whole again." For a time it was. The temples were repaired, the statues washed clean, and hymns rose again to the heavens. The two lands were one. Do you ever notice, traveler, how history moves like the Nile? Flooding, receding, returning. Never the same, yet always itself? But peace is a fragile current. Beyond the eastern desert, a new power was awakening. Assyria, cruel and hungry, their armies swept across the Levant, like locusts over a harvest. When they reached Egypt, they did not come to pray. I saw their iron weapons glint in the sun, their banners marked with lions and thunder. They burned cities, slaughtered priests, and tore gold from temple doors. Even the sacred animals were not spared. A priest beside me wept, his hands trembling over the shattered head of a statue. "Not even the Hyksos did this," he whispered. "The Assyrians came like a storm, and vanished just as swiftly. In their wake, Egypt bled but endured. We had learned long ago, how to survive conquerors. Then came the Persians. Cold, efficient, organized. They did not seek our God's approval. They sought tribute. They called Egypt a satrapy, a province of the great king. And yet, even they bowed, at least in public, to our ancient ways. Their kings dressed as pharaohs in temple reliefs, offering incense to Ammonius, as if they too feared the silence that would come from defying our gods. Empire after empire, I wrote, each claiming Egypt, each forgetting that Egypt belongs to time alone. Do you see the pattern, traveler? Every stranger who claimed this land eventually became part of it. The Nile swallowed them all, their languages, their laws, their names, washing them smooth, leaving only Egypt behind. At night I would sit by the river and watch the moon tremble in the current. Its light was soft, ancient, forgiving. No matter how many crowns were broken, the moon still rose, the river still flowed, and in the hush between waves, I could almost hear the old gods breathing. Close your eyes. Feel the slow rhythm of water against stone. That is the heartbeat of Egypt. Older than kings, stronger than conquest, patient as eternity itself. The empire was gone, but the dream remained. For 3,000 years I had written of kings, their wars, their monuments, their prayers. Now, in the soft twilight of history, a queen took the throne. Her name was Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, the final voice of a land that once spoke with the tongue of gods. I met her first in Alexandria, a city unlike any other, Greek in its streets, Egyptian in its soul. Marble columns rose beside lotus ponds, and the library, vast, shimmering, held the wisdom of the world. She entered the room as dawn enters a temple, quiet, golden, unstoppable. Her eyes held centuries. She spoke 7 languages, but her Egyptian was perfect. She did not read it from scrolls. She sang it, as if the Nile itself had taught her the words. Others wear the crown, she said to me once, but I remember why it shines. Have you ever seen someone who carried a civilization inside them? That was her. Every gesture, every breath, seemed to echo with the voices of all who came before. Hatshepsut, Nefertiti, Ramesses, and even the nameless farmers, who shaped the mud and wrote in the sand. Her reign was fragile, a thread stretched between empires. To the west, Rome, hungry, ruthless, its legions marching like time itself. To the east, the fading kingdoms of Persia and Syria. And in between, a queen with a mind sharper than any sword. She ruled with elegance and calculation, balancing tribute, trade, and charm. Like a dancer over water, the Romans underestimated her. They saw only beauty. They did not see the fire beneath the silk. When Julius Caesar came to Egypt, he found not a submissive ally, but a mirror, someone who understood power as he did. Their union was not just of hearts, but of minds, and for a brief, impossible moment, Egypt breathed again as it once had, a whisper of empire in a changing world. I remember the night her son, Caesarion, was born. The temple bells rang softly, and the priest declared, "The god has returned." Cleopatra smiled, but there was sorrow in it. She knew the gods no longer ruled the earth. Men with iron and ambition did. After Caesar's death came Antony, the Roman who saw in her not conquest, but eternity. Together they lived as pharaohs reborn, in palaces filled with incense and music, while the world beyond their walls prepared for war. They loved as empires do, grandly, desperately, knowing love alone could not save them. When the Roman fleets approached Actium, the sea turned black with sails. I watched from the cliffs as the wind shifted and the future, once golden, began to darken. They fled. Rome followed. And in the end, all the wisdom, all the beauty, all the glory of Egypt's last queen was cornered within her own palace. The marble floors that once glowed with torchlight were silent now. Octavian's banners hung over the harbor. The sound of the sea drowned out the prayers of the priests. Cleopatra stood by the window, the evening sun on her face. She said to me softly, "They think they have conquered Egypt, but they will never hold her heart." She sent her servants away. In her chamber, a small basket waited. Inside, coiled and quiet, a serpent of gold and death. No one saw her final breath, but I felt it, a tremor through the walls, a sigh across the centuries, and I wrote her name, not in ink, but in tears. Cleopatra Philopator, she who loves her father. She who loved her people. She who loved beyond empire. Do you ever think about endings, traveler? How they are never truly ends, but doors closing softly, so that memory can walk through? Rome took her kingdom, but not her story. For centuries, poets would whisper her name, painters would chase her image, and dreamers would see her eyes in the stars above the Nile. The gods were gone, the temples silent, but Egypt lived on. In language, in legend, in the pulse of human wonder. And I, the Eternal Scribe, set down my final words. The kings are dust, the queens are wind, but Egypt is the breath between them, forever. Now close your eyes, the torches fade. The river hums its lullaby to the sea, and somewhere beneath the shifting sand, the heart of a queen still beats, in time with your own. Sleep well, traveler, for as long as dreams remember her, Egypt will never die.